Good afternoon, if you happen to be in the East Coast or the Midwest. It's about lunchtime in Los Angeles. I'm in London, where it's about 8 o'clock in the evening, and we're bringing you our first international I Was Just Thinking since COVID started. I'm Rudy Maxa, travel journalist and broadcaster. Nice to have you in the house. My guest today is David Hume Kennerly. You may very well know his name. The subject is Have Camera, Will Travel. He's one of America's most famous photographers. He was Gerald Ford's White House chief personal photographer, and he's got a long journalism history that you won't believe that we'll be talking about this hour, particularly about his travels around the world, his service in Vietnam. This picture was taken, 4 or 5 years ago, I think, in Santa Monica. We were having a breakfast or a lunch. I've known David for a long time, and I found this in my archives while planning today's webcast, so I thought I'd put it up there. If you don't follow us in social media, please do. You can see this episode beginning in about 24 hours. You can send it to a friend if you find it of interest, and somebody else might find it of interest. Just go to my YouTube channel, which is SavTrav49, and you can watch any of the past episodes replayed. And again, as I say, this one as well. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Nice to have you here. Let me just give a brief, this is going to sound long, but it's a brief biography of David. In 1972, he became one of the youngest photographers to receive a Pulitzer Prize for feature photography. That was for his coverage of the Vietnam War, also for his coverage of East Pakistani refugees fleeing into India. And he also covered the Ali versus Frazier fight of the century that took place in 1971 in Madison Square Garden. Those were the photographs that won him the Pulitzer. 2 years later, as I said, he joined the White House staff of President Gerald Ford. And he came to be known for having an unprecedented access to both the work life as well as the personal life of Gerald Ford and his family. He has extensive film experience as well. He was nominated for a Primetime Emmy as executive producer of NBC's The Taking of Flight 847. You may remember that flight if you're as old as I am. The flight was memorialized in a TV movie starring Lindsay Wagner, and it chronicled the hijacking of a TWA flight by Hezbollah fighters and the role of a TWA flight attendant named Uli Derricks, who was involved in that incident. He was also the writer and executive producer of a 2-hour NBC pilot called Shooter, starring Helen Hunt, that was based on David's Vietnam experiences. The list of accomplishments goes on and on. He shot many of the photos and produced the book Barack Obama, the official inaugural book, and his photos have graced the covers of more than 50 magazines, including Time, Newsweek, Life. And that includes a 1978 cover story of a madman named Jim Jones, who convinced his followers to drink poison. Many of us remember that. A congressman was killed in the melee along with 900 of his followers who did drink that poison. David was there investigating a congressman was killed while he was investigating reports of some of the followers of Jones being held against their will. A couple of journalists perished as well. David arrived there to film that, or to shoot that massacre. It's probably a bad word to use, to shoot pictures of that massacre. And the sight of all those bodies impacted him more than what he'd seen in his 2 years in Vietnam, he would recall later. It actually caused him nightmares. I'm delighted to have David here. David, let me just start with the very beginning. How did you become interested in photography, and when did you know it was going to be your life?
I'm an Oregonian. I grew up in Roseburg, which is a little lumber town. And when I was a kid, I was taking pictures probably when I was 11, 12 years old. And there was a couple of events happened early on. One, unfortunately, I didn't shoot, but this was the anniversary in August of the 1959, it was called The Blast in Oregon. And what reminded me of it the other day was all that ammonium nitrate that blew up in Beirut. A truck loaded with ammonium nitrate was parked overnight next to a building supply store in Roseburg. And the store caught on fire, the supply house. And I heard the sirens go off because in those towns, they have these big, almost like an air raid siren to call in the volunteer firemen. And it was 1:30 in the morning, and I had these French doors on my bedroom, fortunately, actually, or French windows. And so I was looking out, and you could see the fire. Our house is only like 5 blocks away. and there was this tremendous explosion. I mean, it looked like an H-bomb went off. It blew me all the way across the room. It broke every window in our house. 15 people died in the explosion. The town was on fire. The building supply store, when it went up in the explosion, it rained burning pieces of wood all over Roseburg. And as you can imagine, that's a long time ago, but it still sticks in my mind. But I didn't get a picture of it. One of my little minor regrets. But mainly, I wanted to be where the action was. Stuff like that certainly didn't hurt. It never really occurred to me that you could make a living at it. But my first published photograph was in the Orange R newspaper, the high school newspaper, in 1962. And so on and so forth. Really, the career started there.
And with the first camera, did your parents give it to you, or did you go out and buy it? Did you get it in a Cracker Jack box? How did you come to?
I had a Brownie Hawkeye, which I think everybody had at the time, and I remember I got a flash for it where you could screw in these big flash bulbs, and I was always experimenting with that stuff. But then when I graduated from high school, and that was in West Lynn, Oregon, right outside of Portland, I knew I was going to be a professional photographer. I had a scholarship to go to Portland State College, which, in those days it was probably worth about, $25 or something. But I went to work in a flour mill, Centennial Flour Mills, in order to make enough money to buy a really good camera. I got a Canon, and two things happened. I raised the money to buy the camera, and I discovered I was not cut out for that kind of labor. We used to load boxcars with 50-pound sacks of flour, and I really admire people that work for a living like that, but that was not going to be my career path.
And so, and did you take pictures then for your college paper?
Yeah, so the Portland State College paper, and I got I ended up going to college for about a half hour ultimately. Number one, I never liked school that much. I think I probably would be diagnosed with attention deficit syndrome if they had that kind of thing. Basically, my report cards reflected the fact that I did not pay attention in class. And the reason was I was always kind of wondering what was going on outside the window.
Out there.
My life has been consumed with curiosity. It's like you as a reporter, or any of us who are in the news business or any kind of writing, photography. I mean, you really like to know what's going on. And the big break came when one of the Oregon Journal photographers got a 6 months gig in the military, and they hired me as a replacement. And it was very clear it was going to be for 6 months. And I was 19 years old, and the Oregon Journal was the biggest afternoon paper in Portland. The Oregonian was number one, biggest paper. And it was honestly, I mean, I look back on those days, I wish I had taken more pictures in the newsroom. If any of you have ever seen the front page, it was like that. It had the bullpen and like the copy editors with their green visors, and we had, the photographers had our own little, the room and the dark room, and most of the guys were older, and so when they sent me to cover the fires and all that, and 6 months went by. The other photographer, was Ron Bennett, by the way, came back, and I got called into the publisher's office. I thought, oh my gosh, this is the end of it. That's the guy that was isolated from everybody. He was not a real touchy-feely person. And I thought he was going to, well, thanks, kid, you did a great job. And he had all these stack of newspapers with my pictures in them. He said, I just want to tell you, you've done a great job. And one picture particularly struck him. It was a deer that had been burned in a forest fire. It wasn't dead, and they ran it on the front page. And it had a big effect on like fire prevention ads and all that. He said, this one really made an impact. He said, so I would like to offer you a full-time position. And I was floored. And the guy's name was William Knight, and his son was Phil Knight, who started Nike. Well, the William Knight now, thanks to Phil, has the law school named after him in University of Oregon. But that's how I started, and I never looked back, really.
You know, you talked about wanting to be there, be out there, be right where the action is. I think there's a corollary to that. When people say, why did I become a journalist? Why was a Washington Post sort of scandal monger and in my early career for 20 years? I also wanted to be, besides being there, as you put it, I also wanted to be the first to tell someone something. And I think I know from your career, you want to be the first to show someone something. You wanted to capture it. You wanted to show it. I know you made your, very, very early on, you made your reputation shooting in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. But my memories, I didn't know you back then. Did you go over there on your own, or did you go over for a publication paying your way?
Well, no. In my trajectory from the Oregon Journal, well, I also went in the Army for 6 months. That I did went to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and I went to Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indianapolis, in the National Guard, Oregon National Guard, and came back out. And then I got a job with UPI in Los Angeles, United Press International Wire Service. Mm-hmm. And that was like a phenomenal experience. I mean, wire photographers have to cover everything from sports to shootouts to whatever. And one experience I had for UPI was there was an escaped murderer holed up in a single-story motel that was in Manhattan Beach. And I went over and I'm like standing out in the driveway, and all of a sudden the guy blows up some dynamite and he comes crawling out of the window, and the cops shoot him down. And he's crawling along the pavement and looking up at me. And I didn't waver. I just stood there and I took the photos. And there was a CBS cameraman. The two of us were out there together. And I think that's when I realized that I could operate under fire. I mean, the overriding feeling I had was I got to get these pictures. You know, it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to get killed. Although, believe me, that has crossed my mind. And then I ran into Dirk Halstead, who was a mentor of mine. He was the chief UPI photographer, and he convinced UPI to bring me back to New York. So in 1969, the year of the amazing Mets, I covered the World Series there. And then they sent me down to Washington, D.C., and I had my first ride on Air Force One when I was 23 years old, and in 1970 as a member of the press pool. That airplane, by the way, for all of you who like to go to presidential libraries, that airplane is in an atrium at the Ronald Reagan Library in Simi Valley. And all I could think about is when I went on to have a look at it is, wow, this is way smaller than I remember it. So, but yes. So then essentially UPI sent me over to Vietnam. I was going to replace Kent Potter, who was one of their photographers. Mm-hmm. Larry Burroughs, who had been one of my heroes, was over there, and he was a Life magazine photographer. And those guys and two other photographers got killed right before I took off for the United States to go to Vietnam. And I think that's what, and I'll never forget it because it was frightening. I didn't know them, but Potter had a good reputation as a UPI photographer. Larry Burroughs was really one of the greatest photographers of all time, and I was a huge fan of his. But the only problem I had to get out of the Army to go to the war. Because I was in the reserves, they didn't exactly have weekend meetings in Saigon. And fortunately, I had a commanding officer who was a general, a lawyer by day in Washington, D.C., who took it up with the brass over at the Pentagon. and they agreed to give me a leave of absence so I could go over, and they didn't feel it was going to cause an ugly precedent of people getting out to go to Vietnam. I may have been, actually Frank Johnson was another one that did it, but that's how I got to Saigon.
And so were you with UPI your entire time when you were in Vietnam for 2 years?
No, I the year I won, well, I won the Pulitzer in 1972 for my work in 1971. And one of the pictures, because of the last big assignment I covered before I left for Southeast Asia, was the Ali-Frazier fight. And that picture of Ali getting knocked down was on the front page of the New York Times. I was 23 when I took the picture, and my birthday was the next day. So my 24th birthday present was having a photo on the front of the New York Times of Ali going down in the 15th round. And so that picture, along with pictures from Cambodia, from refugees from East Pakistan coming into India, which essentially precipitated the India-Pakistan War in 1971, and then combat action from Vietnam and combat action from Cambodia. And, you know, that was a rough year for me. I truly thought I would never see my 25th birthday.
Really?
Because I was out in the field so much, getting shot at and taking pictures. But I could have left at any time, but it never occurred to me that I'd had enough. Then when I won the Pulitzer, Life magazine hired me, and I think Dave Burnett and I were the last two photographers hired by Life, and they folded like 2 or 3 months later, and Time magazine then kept me on a contract, so I made that leap over to Time.
Do you like to travel?
I do, and but let's just say I haven't been doing any of it. I know you hopped on a plane to go to London. I haven't been. My last flight, I had it in my calendar. It's been 7 months since I've been on an airplane. This is the longest in 50 years, easily.
Right.
And I just don't feel like taking the chance. I mean, I've taken a lot of chances in my life, and ironically, these photographers, friends from the way they end up, and people have covered a lot of tough stories, always something you never expect, like looking the wrong way in London's a favorite, getting run over by a big red double-decker.
Right.
But I just right at this point don't feel like taking that kind of a risk. And normally I would have been at the debates the other night. In a last election I covered for CNN, so I was on the road for that. Mm-hmm. I did do the New Hampshire primary this year in February, and that's right before it really hit the fan.
Right. Cheryl asks, David, who owns the pictures that you take? Or does that vary by publication?
That's a good question. Mainly, I've been freelance my whole career. And the big news in my life recently was my archive was acquired by the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona. Mm-hmm. And my wife, Rebecca, really has spearheaded putting my archive in shape for the last 15 years. And in order to sell something, you have to own it. And so most of my work I've owned. The UPI days was an exception, and my time in the Ford White House was an exception. But those, I have full access to all the material. The Ford material is owned by the public. It's in the National Archives. But the Center for Creative Photography was started by Ansel Adams in 1975. He was the co-founder with John Schaefer, who was the young president of the University of Arizona, and basically made Ansel an offer he couldn't refuse. And he said he would build a building for Ansel's archive. And so I joined the likes of Ansel, who was a friend of mine. I had one of my time covers was of Ansel Adams. Edward Weston, Eugene Smith, Richard Avedon, on and on and on. It's just a fantastic archive, and also allows me to interact with students. And there are almost 1 million items in my in the archive itself, from negatives, transparencies, prints, etc.
1 million. Well, let's look at a couple of your photographs. Well, the first one is an eclipse in 2017 in Oregon. Is it easy to shoot a solar eclipse?
Not really. You can't get it with your iPhone. That's for damn sure. This is with a 1200 millimeter lens, but you could see the fire coming out from the sides. Mm-hmm. I got to tell you, Rudy, after I've seen a lot of stuff in my life, and I've been in 100+ countries on assignments, and this was really one of the most thrilling and awesome sights I'd ever witnessed. And I had read about how you shoot eclipses, and so this is in totality. And I was up in Monmouth, Oregon. It was right in the path of the eclipse. And there's another one coming up in 2024, which I want to go photograph. And it's going through Vermont, for one thing. And Senator Pat Leahy is a good friend of mine, and he's an amateur photographer. And I called him and I said, you gotta go do this eclipse with me. You'll never forget it. And I could see where people get obsessed by traveling around and photographing these events. I mean, there's nothing like it. I swear to God. So that's why I put this picture up of that. And if you're traveling, which your audience loves to travel, make a note of the eclipse. You can find out exactly where the totality will be, what path it'll be in. You try to find someplace where you're not going to get clouded out. But I highly recommend this one. Everybody can do it. You need a longer lens to get a better picture, however.
It's really a great one. And this one is also in Oregon. This is a shot, Michael's going to put it up, of waves crashing, and I guess wild birds, seagulls, I guess.
Yeah, seagulls. And this is Rebecca and I have a place up in Coos Bay, Oregon, mm-hmm. Which is only about, which is that area is really known for Bandon Dunes Golf Course, where they have 4 of the best golf courses on the planet. I mean, people come from all over the world to play golf there. Bandon is 15 minutes, 20 minutes south of where I took this picture. And it was one of those things where it's called Shore Acres State Park. I highly recommend people going there if they're passing through that part of Oregon. If you're really lucky, you'll see something like this. This is not a daily event. But I always keep an eye on the weather, and I try to figure out, in fact, I just wrote a piece about this picture for Canon that's going to come out. Canon sponsors me, and I do a lot of social media for them. But it's how do you get a good picture? And part of it is research, trying to figure out when something like this might happen. And so we check the weather. The tide has to be just right. There has to be an offshore storm of some kind, and everything lined up here because it was sunny. You see the clouds in the background, so the sun's kind of hitting it at the side when this giant wave crashes, and you can see some of the birds are silhouetted, some of them are highlighted. And it just was like literally a perfect storm for a photo.
Well, I noticed the first 2 photos are black. Well, no, I guess you had the flames coming out of the sun. Do you shoot a lot of black and white?
Yeah, I think with the Canon or any kind of camera, like what I'll do now, there's no reason to shoot black and white, but sometimes I'll convert it like this. This is a color picture. But okay. Believe it or not, there wasn't a lot of color in the photo, and so I thought it would look better as a black and white picture. Mm-hmm. And that's a choice you could make. Obviously, shooting black and white film, you don't have the option of getting color out of it, but shooting in color, what we all do. And I've been shooting digital now for really since the quality came up to my standard. So I think around 2005, so about 15 years. Um, I made the transition as an old dog. I learned new digital tricks. A lot of guys my age or older just didn't want to make the transition with the technology and all that. But I didn't want to stop. I mean, I'm still, going full bore as much as I can.
And I know you've written a number of books. I think one of them was how to take good pictures using an iPhone. So you
That's
don't
right.
do as a professional photographer the iPhone, do you?
Well,
Or
David Hume
any digital
Kennerly
phone?
on the iPhone is the name of the book. It may still be in print, but you could get it through your normal sources. But my Rebecca encouraged me to do a book about my process, and I said, "Yeah, I never really thought about it, and it's one of the reasons I'm not a great teacher, probably because for one thing, I'm too demanding. And so, what do you mean you can't take that picture? But the and I'm demanding of myself first and foremost, which is why I think I've succeeded in this business. But the iPhone or any kind of a mobile phone, it's a camera. A camera's a camera. An iPhone now, you've got like three options: a real super wide
Hmm.
lens, and then like a normal lens and a small telephoto. And so you have more options. The quality's good. Nothing beats the Canon images. So in terms of quality, that's like a 48 megabyte file, so you can blow it up huge. And I get asked all the time, if the quality is so much better with the Canons, why don't you shoot these pictures? I said I just wouldn't. I never carried my camera around day in and day out, but the
But you
the
have your phone.
phone and camera you do. And so really it was, I was taking so many pictures I never would have made before, and I love it. I do it every day. I have a photo group on my Facebook page called the Kennerly Photo Fitness Workout, and I put it up for COVID because there's so many people. These were limited to the people that are actually my Facebook friends, but uh, so many people are stuck at home, and so my workout idea is, and the ongoing assignment I gave everybody was photograph something that you look at every day and don't see. And it's amazing. I mean, when you start paying attention to what's around you in your backyard, in the house, like um, overcoming familiarity in photography is really the hardest thing. Like working in the White House, I mean, it would be exciting if you were there just one time. But if you're, this is a for instance, day in and day out, like how do you make it work? The New York Times photographer Doug Mills, who's covering the Trump administration now, really does some amazing work because a lot of it's about the angle, like put a remote camera in the ceiling, on the floor, but mainly you're still looking for the moment. The moment is what counts. It's not just a well-exposed photo of grandma. That the good news is you can tell who it is, but how do you elevate that into a better picture?
Let's show a moment next. Michael, can you put up the
We
shot
show
of?
grandma. I don't think I have her.
I don't need your camera. I thought a couple Supreme Court justices might be interesting. Michael,
There you
David, you want to
go.
narrate this photo?
Well, this picture, another thing, and because you're over in England, and which is the home of irony, I believe. Um, I think of irony makes for great photographs, and this is a perfect example. The first two women Supreme Court justices, Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, sitting in Statuary Hall of the U.S. Capitol, surrounded by statues of men. These are two of the most important women in history. And of course, Ruth Bader Ginsburg recently died. And in another irony, she laid in state right there in that room in the U.S. Capitol.
Mm-hmm.
And Justice O'Connor's still alive and retired in Arizona. But this photograph has been a huge favorite just because of who the women are and the situation itself. And this was taken in 2001. And I believe I took this with a black and white film. In fact, I know I did.
Beautiful shot, beautiful shot. If you've just joined us, my guest is David Hume Kennerly. Won his Pulitzer at a very young age in his early 20s for his work shooting refugees from eastern Pakistan fleeing into India, as well as his work in Vietnam, and covering the fight of the century between Frazier and Ali in Madison Square Garden. And we're talking a little bit about travel, as always, because he's just happened to mention in a previous answer that he'd been to about 100 countries. And obviously, your travel took you everywhere. Let's talk a little about traveling with the president. You were with the Gerald Ford administration for a couple of years. You had incredible access. I mean, I think I correctly recall, because I knew you, I think I met you shortly thereafter, but I certainly knew about you since I was a Washington Post reporter, that you had more access than most White House photographers before you ever had. Is that a correct memory on my part?
I would say, I mean, and I'll give you a snapshot of history about this. Obviously, a favorite subject of mine. In the White House, chief White House photographer, or the personal photographer to the president, is a role that was established by LBJ. And the first guy to do it was Yoichi Okamoto. And Okamoto had worked for USIA, which is the United States Information Agency, and had done a trip with Johnson when Johnson was VP, and Johnson liked his photographs. And so, but JFK and previously, mainly the US military, had been doing the photography. And now in the case of JFK, he would allow a lot of photographers from the outside to come in. The famous picture of John JFK Jr. under the desk was taken by UPI photographer Stanley Tredick and so on. But when Oki came in, shortly after LBJ became president, he gave him really total access. You've never seen anything like it. And I produced a documentary for Discovery. It was a 4-hour documentary with the Naudet brothers, who did the 9/11 video and won the Emmy, and Chris Whipple, who did the interviews of all the chiefs of staff. But in my research, I went to all the presidential libraries and looked at all the pictures. And I'd known Oki, and I knew his work, but not the way I saw it in opening context sheets of the work. Extraordinary. He's really the godfather of presidential photography. Nobody's been better than him, including me. The next guy who had it was Ollie Atkins with Nixon. And Nixon really didn't allow him much access. I mean, it really was kind of a photographic disaster area, because it wasn't Ollie's fault. He just couldn't get he didn't have the access. And then I came along, and President Ford, when he offered me the job the day he became president, I told him I would be interested in the job if I had total access and reported directly to him. And he kind of like couldn't believe somebody was like that forward, and said, "You don't want Air Force One on the weekends." So, but he gave me the job, and really, there was no way to have more access. Let's just put it that way. Mm-hmm. And then it's varied with the different photographers who Michael Evans with Reagan came. Carter didn't have a White House photographer, although he kept the guys who were there, who worked for me, and then Evans came along, and then after with Reagan, and then Dave Valdez with George Herbert Walker Bush, and Jeff McNeely with Clinton, and Sharon Farmer, who was the first woman both an African-American woman to do the job with Bill Clinton after McNeely had left. And now it just varies. So I wouldn't say nobody could have had more, and Oki was in the same barrel, but everybody's had different degrees of it. Eric Draper with Bush, and of course Pete Souza with his Obama photos. Very good relationship, and you really have to have a good relationship with the president as the photographer. They have to trust you. President Ford said my tombstone should read, "Here lies the worst source in Washington." So I wasn't talking to guys like you, Rudy, and giving them like hot scoop.
Yeah, I know you weren't. Did you? I mean, I guess if did presidents? You don't have to run through them all, but
By the way, these are the Kennerly boys.
Yeah, I remember when a couple of them were
Nick,
little guys.
James, and Byron.
I remember Byron before he had a beard.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, by the way, that picture was taken down at on the Great Barrier Reef. We were up in Cairn, the way they pronounce it, I guess. And so they all learned how to dive and went diving. I stayed up and took pictures. So.
One last question about presidents. Did they have approval over your photographs before you released them to the public?
That's a really good question. That varies too. My relationship was I pretty well released what I wanted, but more important, I think, was, and you knew, like all the Washington Post stars like Frank Johnston and
Bill Snead,
particularly was covering the White House, and Frankie came in and did a book. He spent weeks with a book where he went around with me, and he had like incredible access. I believe. I mean, I looked at the charts, or not the chart, the schedules and everything. That one of my biggest accomplishments as a White House photographer was creating access for outside photographers to come in and do their own work. And Fred Ward was one who came and spent 3 months doing a book on President Ford. Obviously, they couldn't go into classified meetings, but there was a lot of stuff they could do. And Ford liked photographers. He trusted them. There's a rigid ethic among those of us who do that kind of work where you don't disclose what you heard. You don't want to not get in the room for the photos. And so I think I'm proudest of that, really, of everything I've done, because subsequently and before, outside photographers have had really not good access. And we had a combination of me, who had the ability to do it, and a president who liked photographers and liked their work and said, "Sure, come on down."
And he didn't have to censor. He didn't ask to see everything before it was.
No. And it was me. I released pictures through the press office, but basically the ones I took, he never looked at a picture. He would see them later on. I have one picture of him meeting with Don Rumsfeld, who was his chief of staff, who was wearing a suit, and his military aide and his personal aide, and he had pajamas on. It was an early morning meeting in Tokyo, and that picture got published, and he never said, "Well, I didn't like that." Never heard that from him. He totally let me do my own thing. It was the best working relationship. And also, Gerald Ford was a tremendous human being. I mean,
yeah, he was. He had a great sense of humor, didn't he? Great sense of humor,
and it was like he respected other people. He was a live and let live guy. I mean, considering he was born in like 1913, I think, he was a man who was colorblind. He didn't look at the world like them and us. And he was such a great example for me and for the country, really.
Maybe you can answer this. Not in time. We got a lot of questions. I've got a lot of questions. We got a couple more photographs to look at. But Don asks, what are the 2 or 3 most important aspects you think of when you're sizing up a photo possibility? Can you articulate that in 2 minutes?
I could try.
You could probably teach a course on it.
It's funny. Well, when I did the iPhone book, I'm immediately looking for composition, even though, and it's a lot of this is sort of subtext in my mind. I mean, it's not always at the front. The first thing I'm always looking for is like, what's the story? What's the picture? How do I tell this with one frame, really? And that's the wire service mentality. The 4x5 speed graphic days kind of stuff. Content. It's not about making people look good or bad. It's how do I get into one instant something where you look at it and go, oh my gosh, I now know more than I did about whatever that was. And obviously you don't have time to compose stuff carefully when you're under fire or whatever, but that factors in foreground, and editing after the fact. Like, the one thing my admonishment to anybody who's on social media, which is all of you probably, if you must put out a picture of your cat, pick the best one. Don't put out 10 pictures because you can't make up your mind. And so a lot of what I had to do was after the fact, like, what's the picture then when you edit? Editing is so important, and cropping it right and all that.
I always encourage people to fill the frame and to not be shy about going up close to a person. I mean, ask their permission if you don't know them and they're not, don't be rude about it. But let's look at one of your photos that is certainly a very close and emotional photo.
Yes. Well, this was taken in, excuse me. This was taken in New Hampshire, Hampton, New Hampshire, in February, and Biden was campaigning. I was going around and photographing all the candidates, including Trump. I made this picture with a 400 millimeter lens in a room, and you could feel it here. It was very powerful for me as a dad of 3 boys, certainly, what Joe Biden has been through in his life with losing a daughter and his wife, and the 2 boys were in the car and were hurt. And this is before he was sworn in as senator, after he'd won the election. But he was talking about Beau Biden. There was a moment the other night in the debate that sickened me, really, was that former Vice President Biden's trying to talk about Beau, and he's then interrupted about Hunter Biden having a drug problem or something. I mean, stupendously awful moment, really, and there were plenty of them. But here's the real thing. I mean, when you see this picture, obviously you need to know the background, but he was talking and he internalizes this stuff. And my job as a photographer really is to get a moment like that to translate something about what's inside of a person, not just like a pretty made up headshot for your resume.
Now, why were you using such a long lens if you were inside, or were you far away from him?
Well, it wasn't that far, but this gives me the dynamic moment where the 400, and it's a great lens. It's a 1:400 zoom, and it's I use it all the time for like press conferences. And my hobby, by the way, is shooting bird photos. So it's also good for that. But you can see all of a sudden this gives you like a up close personal picture of this guy, and I didn't have to be in his face to take it. And True. He's behind, not that far from me. I mean, your advice is good about filling the frame, and that this is pretty much a full frame, maybe cropped in a little bit, but
you get can't you? Yeah,
you get the impact of what you're seeing here. I mean, I think, like Bill Clinton said, I can feel your pain. I could feel his pain in the room, and I think I translated that in this moment. I would hope.
You did. Paul asks, what famous person, living or dead, would you have liked to photograph but have not had the opportunity to photograph?
Well, during my lifetime so far, there were a couple of people I would have liked to have photographed, and mainly because they didn't have a lot of access, or in the case of Howard Hughes, zero. In fact, he was just pathologically private, and that would have been a good moment. Anybody that goes to those kind of links, not to have their picture taken, I want to take their picture. Mao Zedong, I had could have been an opportunity when I went with President Ford to China in 1975. Ford was the last Western leader that met with Mao. He was very ill and died the next year.
Why didn't you take
now, I would love to go to North Korea and spend a day with Kim Jong-un. He's a fascinating character. I mean, look, he's got, nuclear weapons apparently, and he's a player. He's a player. I mean, look, Donald Trump couldn't wait to go have a photo op with him, and it hadn't turned out very well, but he's the one guy on the planet that I would like to photograph. I've been to North Korea. It's a fascinating place. And like people, any place that it's hard to get into, I want to go there. That's my job.
How did you miss the picture of Mao Zedong if you were there with Gerald Ford?
No, they wouldn't let me in. The Chinese wouldn't let me in. I even had Kissinger.
Wouldn't let you in China, or wouldn't let you in the meetings with Mao Zedong?
It was really, it was the president and like Mrs. Ford and Susan Ford and Henry Kissinger. No, the Chinese wouldn't allow him to be photographed by an outsider. He probably hadn't had his picture taken by an outsider in 30 years, maybe.
So you were in China.
He wasn't looking very good.
You were in China, though. You were there.
No, I was there. I was there in Peking. Yeah.
Anybody else?
The host of the trip was mainly Deng Xiaoping.
Oh, okay.
Had a lot of access to him, a lot of good pictures of him. I photographed Zhou Enlai in 1972 when I went in with Prime Minister of Japan, Tanaka. Mm-hmm. That was a great trip. Cultural Revolution period still. That was right after the Nixon trip. Nixon was February 72, and I got in there in October 1st, today. On this day in 1972, I was in Shanghai.
Wow. Anybody else anybody currently now you'd love to photograph?
Not really.
No rock stars.
I don't. I'm stumbling for words because I hadn't really thought about it except for Kim. Mm-hmm. But all the other world leaders don't intrigue me that much these days, to be honest with you.
No, I just want
think about the people I have photographed. I was up close with Brezhnev. I was up close with Fidel Castro, Ceausescu, Franco, some of the despotic all-time winners.
Hit parade.
I've photographed so many Gorbachev, Ivan Chernenko, who was briefly the head of the Soviet Union. They're fascinating people. Anyone who had their own personality cult is immediately a favorite of mine.
Yeah, that's why I wondered if you woke up one morning and thought, some of those Rolling Stone guys have some pretty interesting faces. And, did you ever want to shoot Mick Jagger or guys?
Well, I did. I photographed Mick Jagger when he was 23 years old on their first tour in 1966 in Portland, Oregon. And I was with Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy. I didn't see. He died. I was a sophomore in high school. One of those never forget where I was at that moments. And, Trump I photographed a lot. I did a portrait session with Donald Trump at Trump Tower right after he won the election for the cover of the CNN book, Unprecedented. And, covering him, you get yelled at a lot because you're in the media. It's not that much fun.
By him or by his followers?
Oh, no, him. He can handle all that himself, yeah.
Let's go to 1978 and the Jonestown Massacre. You were in Florida, as I recall, on doing something else, and the news sort of came around this happened, and you took out your credit card and chartered a plane with a colleague and went down to Guyana. Was it Guyana? I can't even remember.
Yeah, it was called Guyana, formerly British Guyana.
And
the tip of South America. Yes, we were, Don Neff, who was a Time correspondent, and I were working on a Colombian drug story about smuggling drugs from Colombia into the United States. Mm-hmm. And we were ultimately going to be ending up back in Colombia and going out, which we did. But it was like a Saturday or Friday night, and we got this word that a U.S. Congressman, Leo Ryan from San Francisco, had been shot when he visited this religious group. I mean, that's all we had. It wasn't like today where you probably would have had cell phone footage. We really didn't know much. But the rumor was that whoever this group was holed up in the jungle and that they were going to fight the army. The mass suicide thing didn't even come up.
No, you didn't know that.
At that moment, we didn't know. In fact, fast forward, yes, we chartered a jet, flew from Miami to Georgetown, Guyana, and managed to get in to Port Kaituma, which is where the plane had been with Leo Ryan, and they had come out of the jungle and killed them there. I mean, it's too long a story to recount, but we were able then to have the Guyanese military fly us in. But as we're flying over Jonestown, we got closer and closer in the airplane. I saw all these people there, and there have been rumors about suicide. But I said, look at all those people down there. There are a lot of people who are alive. But as we got closer, you could see that it was all the people were dead. And it was the most shocking single moment of my life. I can't begin to tell you because we didn't know. And it looked at a distance like they were all gathered around this pavilion where they had a lot of buildings in this place. You know, Jonestown, Jim Jones and his followers who came down from San Francisco, it was a really remote place. That airstrip was a dirt airfield. And it was 12 miles from Jonestown. And so then we got to the ground, and I walked through there with dead bodies. And I think there were 938 dead people there. And in some inside buildings, I photographed Jones's body. It was a horror. It really was a horror.
You were shooting color.
The worst thing about it were all the dead kids. I mean, we talk about mass suicide, but the bottom line, it was mass murder. I mean, who would kill their kids? And they did. They did. They poisoned them.
And you were shooting in color, as I recall. And were you the first photographer to get the photographs? I think they appeared in Newsweek, didn't they?
No, Time.
That was a Time, okay. But were you the first photographer to really get those pictures out?
Well, Frank Johnston, who of the Washington Post, was the pool photographer who got in right before we did. And so his stuff got out first. I'm assuming it went on the wires too. I think he was it. I mean, there were very few photographers ever made it in there. And for one thing, it was impossible to get there, but unless the government cooperated, and we finessed that one, you know, with them. But my film was hand carried to New York for Time. And when we stayed, and Don filed his story we went to Barbados, because we then went on to cover the story of the drug story in Colombia. And but they got the pictures of New York. That was the Time cover. At that point, was the biggest selling Time cover in their history, because it was such an incredible story. I mean, it was nightmarish, as you pointed out.
Let's end on well, anything would be a happier note, obviously. This was not a happy day for John.
Let's end on voter fraud. How would that be?
Let's put up the last photo we have here, Michael, if you don't mind. Michael is my producer, who happens to be in London. I'm actually in Brighton, by the way. I'm outside of London, visiting my granddaughters. This is when John McCain suspended his campaign in Sedona, Utah, and there are the red cliffs of Sedona behind him.
Sedona, Arizona.
Sedona, Arizona, right? What a great place.
Well, I also shot this
clouds later, David. What's the story there? That's just too perfect.
Well, this was John McCain ending his campaign in 2000, and against the backdrop of Sedona, which was unbelievable. Yeah, I also made this picture in black and white with a Mamiya medium format camera, and it's almost the same image, but it was a black and white print, which became a favorite of the McCain's. I made up an edition for them, and they gave it out to all their people who had supported their campaign. But somebody said that this looks like if Ansel Adams did political photography. But it's like a perfect moment. Cindy McCain's right there by him, and it was a sad moment for him.
Sure.
And this also was on my birthday. This is March 9th, 2000.
And you promised.
I got to know McCain. I really respected and admired him. I was permanent party on the Straight Talk Express. That was his bus where he went in New Hampshire and South Carolina. He won the New Hampshire primary and lost in South Carolina. And that basically Bush overcame him there, George W. Bush. But it was one of the best political experiences I'd ever had, because the access to him was phenomenal. I was on the bus the whole time. He liked the press. He liked going back and forth with the press. He wasn't like, no politician likes everything that's written about him. President Ford didn't, but he had a great relationship with the press because he believed in the First Amendment, and he believed in guys like you writing stories that he didn't like. And so, but that's part of the game. You have to understand that when you're in politics. But the McCain family, flash forward to his funeral, asked me to be the family photographer. It was a very sad time, but I was happy to see him off in a way that I think did the ceremony justice for him and the family.
And you promised you didn't Photoshop those clouds in over the mountains so perfectly?
No, there's no Photoshopping there at all. Yeah.
I know there aren't. Yeah. David, thank you so much for spending so much time. I know you're out in California, so it's midday for you, but thanks for spending this much time out of your midday with us. Really appreciate it. And as I said at the beginning, this webcast will be posted on YouTube in about 24 hours. If you have some friends who are interested in photography and I think would find David fascinating, you can go to YouTube and send that along to them. And meanwhile, David, best to you and to Rebecca, and I hope I can fly to California again at some point and see you in person.
Thank you. By the way, I have that same Angkor Wat temple rubbing, or one very similar that's behind you.
Yeah, I have some Bangkok temple rubbings, and I saw that. I mean, my daughter.
That one's a Cambodian one.
It is Cambodian. My daughter, did I give this to you? This is not Thai. She said, no, it's from her husband's mother who got it in Cambodia. And I went,
yeah, wow. Yeah. And you could buy them back before when I was over there in the early 70s, you could buy them in the museum, like authentic temple rubbings for like 25 cents a piece. Now they're invaluable. So.
Well, good eye. Thank you, David. Take care. Okay. And if you'd like to follow us on YouTube, just go YouTube and type in SavTrav49. Just sign up, and you'll be able to see some past interviews with some people fascinating, just as David Hume Kennerly was today. David, goodbye. Goodbye to our audience. See you next week. By the way, next week we're going way underground with a guy who has spent most of his life traveling underground. The mole people of New York subways, the caverns underneath, or the tunnels underneath Paris. He believes in traveling underground. I mean, that's a whole another thing. I'll see you next Thursday. Thanks, David. Take care. Bye-bye.